kidney stones, but we're here now. Sometimes the formality of these things just make me feel silly, so please, I encourage giggling or whatever you want to do, talking, asking questions. But yeah, so my practice over the last few years, where these kind of started was actually in my second year of Emily Carr. I was taking a land-based arts class, and because I had moved to the Musqueam territory, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in Vancouver to go to school, I was very homesick. It was during the pandemic. So something I did to stay connected to home was I harvested ochre pigment from the land, and I practiced making paints through a variety of materials, mixing it with things like bear grease, fish oil, honey, even saliva, just to build my relationship with the material. And that turned into a few different paintings and pictographs, both on rocks, paper, and canvas. And then in my third year, there was an incident in our community where a pictograph site near where I grew up was brutally vandalized. And it makes me emotional just thinking about it. When those pictographs were spray painted, they were spray painted with very vulgar and racist remarks. And I remember the moment when I saw it on the news while I was in Vancouver, and it felt like losing a loved one, seeing that happen. But thankfully, after that incident, our community was able to get a hold of one-of-a-kind worldwide laser technology that could remove that spray paint to protect the pictographs. And so while all that was happening, I did about a year's worth of research in my third year and beginning of my fourth year into that laser technology. And what happens with pictographs when they're a couple hundred to several hundred years old is there's actually a layer of microorganisms that begin to live over top of the pictographs. And they're almost like their own little microbiome. They're invisible to the human eye, but you can see them under a microscope. And they actually absorb the pigments themselves. So these tiny little microorganisms that live on the pictographs become pigmented and they're moving around there. So these pictographs actually become living beings and living documents themselves, which is really cool. And so that pictograph site was able to be saved thanks to this laser technology. And so I wrote a research paper about that. And for class, I had to create a sculpture to accompany that research paper because I majored in sculpture. And that's where this piece came from. I wanted to create a piece that could symbolize how pictographs become their own living beings. And so my thought process in doing that was to take it off of the wall and to give it its own 3D space off of the rocks, something that we could walk around and see. And so this particular pictograph depicts one of our chapped teeth, one of our core stories, how turtle set the animal people free. And so you can see turtle here being carried up into the air by eagle. And so I incorporated the sun and these leading lines to show how it's being carried up into the air here. And because this is one of our core chapped teeth and so integral to who we are as Scéalch, as Seal Okanagan people, I wanted to up the scale to make it larger than us because it's something that we look up to. Yeah, and so that's where this one came from. This one over here is called Flight of Union. And so this one was kind of born after this one because it's really, really hard to take a 2D image and try to make it 3D. And so this one I brought off of the wall, and I wanted to explore with how to further warp it and to give it body, also on an art student budget. So I got to cutting up some sheet metal here. And so in both of these pieces, when I would draw them out, I would go back, like a couple of times I would try to draw on my iPad on Procreate, you know, draw out some pictographs, and they just never ever looked quite right. And that's when I realized, like, well, yeah, our ancestors didn't have an Apple Pencil. Like, you have to go back to your old school tools, finger painting on the wall. So I covered my art studio in papers and just got away to finger painting, and then I would photograph them and transfer them to my iPad. so that I can put them on the CNC machine, etc. So all of these dimensions actually come from my finger but are then blown up. And so with this piece, I hammered all of the metal by hand. It took about 3 days of like 10 hours each hammering out this metal. And it was really cool as I was hammering it. Like at first I just wanted to give it some texture because sheet metal, you know, it is just quite plain and shiny. And I had thought about giving it rock texture, but that would have involved me like begging the golf course to use their big machinery roller to like drive it over some rocks, and that just seemed like too much. So I got away to hammering, and naturally the metal just started warping into these beautiful curves. And then I was able to hang it in school and put it on a motor so that it can rotate. And so this piece, I was trying to think of what pictographs I could draw that aren't necessarily a chaptique or something, because pictographs could mean so many different things, like out on the land. Like some could be depicting a specific site, some could be depicting a story, family lineage, maps, warnings. Like there could be so many different meanings of what a pictograph is. And so I wanted to think of some moments in nature that deserve to have a moment captured like this. And so I was at the river one day and I saw eagles mating, and when they locked talons and swirled down towards the ground, and when they let go, like right before they hit the ground. So that's what I wanted to represent here. And this piece also came following the engagement and wedding to my husband. So love was on the brain for this one, for sure. So that's where these came from. Short and sweet, there are only 2 sculptures, so I'll open it up right now if anybody has questions or anything they'd like to ask me. Somebody be brave.
What paint did you use on both then? What's the ingredients?
For sure. So in some of my other work, I would use ochre paint, but it's very hard to process. Like it can take a long time to make a small amount. So for these, I had processed some and color matched it for the base, but then I did have to do some touch-ups with spray paint. Yeah, thank you.
Where did you see the eagles doing their spiral?
For sure. So these eagles that I saw in that moment was in the Musqueam territory at their river, but also where I grew up in Inkameep. There's a creek lined with many big trees, and there are always eagles there, so I grew up often seeing all of them. And so when I was away at school in Vancouver, I'd often go there to remind myself of home. Yeah.
I see that you have the sun actually being detached, so it's actually rappelling down. So it's almost like its own separate sculpture. What made you decide to not have it attached to the sculpture itself instead of be hanging?
For sure, that's a really good question. So this drawing of this pictograph went through several different stages. The very first time I drew it, none of the elements were attached to one another. But when I was trying to make, the very first time I drew them, I kind of drew them like, the turtle would be freestanding here, the eagle would be over here in the room, and maybe we could walk through the gallery like that to see all the different pieces. But it didn't feel to me like it made sense, and so I started drawing them stacked on top of one another. And I really liked the way they started to form a figure. And so the first couple times, it was really difficult to figure out how to incorporate the sun. A couple of times I just took it out there and just had the bottom 3 figures, but it didn't feel complete. And so I had experimented a few different ways of trying to attach the sun or connecting the sun to the tops of the wings there. But then it kind of turned into like an eye looking thing, and it didn't look right. But I really wanted to incorporate the sun because I feel like it's such an important part of the story, because eagle carries turtles so high up into the sky that to me incorporating the sun was really important. And so eventually I had to detach it from it just to break up all the lines that are so similar in the eagle wings to the sun, which resulted in it going there. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your process of how you create a pictograph.
For sure. So my personal process in creating pictographs, first of all, starts with a lot of research and spending time at the pictograph sites. There are various pictograph sites throughout the Okanagan, and to me, I feel very closely connected to them, as all Okanagan people do, because they were marks left by our ancestors on this land that show that we have been here for several hundred and more years. And so I spend a lot of time at the pictograph sites. I never make a one-to-one copy of a pictograph. I don't believe that's right. And so I spend time with them and study them. And then the same as I kind of mentioned earlier, like I think about what story I want to tell or what I'm exploring. So even when it comes to the eagle, like I've drawn probably 50 different variations of the eagle, but when it comes to this figure, I really like the symmetry that I incorporated into this one. But I like jagged edges. These ones have more straight edges. I spend a lot of time with the pictographs, and so I've kind of built up even my own little personal library in my studio of different pictographs, so now I can start to pull from my own drawings when I'm putting them together. But yeah, I think something I want to further explore, like with this piece, I really focused on telling through my own way one of our Okanagan stories. But I think it would be really cool to experiment in the future, making pictographs that are more open to interpretation, where they don't tell a very specific story.
You referenced a little bit about the materials that you chose and, the art school budget and all that kind of stuff, but, just thinking about that, you've got a bank of pictographs. Have you thought about other things that you might do to create sculptures with those?
Absolutely. So I kind of view these still as rough drafts, like they're probably in like rough draft 3. I would love to create like a public art sculpture one day. Like I really enjoy the scale of these, and I'd love to make them even bigger. But yeah, I've envisioned creating them larger. My family and friends in Vancouver, in the Musqueam Reserve, they've mentored me a lot in like watching them do public art, and so it's something that I definitely want to explore here in the Okanagan, is working on increasing the amount of local Indigenous artwork that we have throughout the valley, and not just at on-reserve businesses, but right in the city centers and waterfronts and important places throughout the Okanagan. Thank you.
What other medium are you exploring? What have you worked with?
For sure.
Kind of school, before school, what do you look forward to?
Yeah. So before I ever went to school, I practiced a lot with a lot of like Indigenous land materials, like hides, beadwork, antlers, wood, carving, things like that. And so when I decided to go to art school, I actually had no idea what I wanted to major in. At the time, my husband and I were both moving to Vancouver so he could also pursue his master's degree. And so I went to Emily Carr in the first year as foundation, so you get to try a bit of everything. And at the time, I was carving a wooden canoe paddle. And I thought, sure, I'll sign up for sculpture class. It seems a lot more connected to me than something like animation or something like techie. I like working like hands-on, like getting my hands dirty in the materials. And so after my first sculpture class, I fell in love, and I took about 6 more. And at Emily Carr, I was able to, go in the wood shop and the metal shop. They have 3D printers, laser cutters, like anything your heart desires. And so I find myself making a lot of maquettes and like dreaming of like smaller size sculptures, and daydreaming about where these could go, like in the public art sphere and like out on the land, like even for this pictograph, like if this were to ever become an art sculpture, I don't want it, like just out in front of a building. Like I really envision it still being a part of the land, like maybe it's in a field with sagebrush around it, and things like that. Yeah, I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about your desire to have public sculptures. What do you think is the role of public art and public sculpture, and why do you want to do that?
I think seeing Indigenous art in the place where those Indigenous people are from, like for starters, like boosts confidence and like connection to place for that local Indigenous nation. It can tell the stories of those sites specifically, and it also is a way to connect Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities to one another by bonding over art and being able to create gathering spaces around art to build community with one another. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, how did you learn about like making your like paint, and how did you like did you talk to anybody else? Did you get advice from an elder, or like learning that process, and was it all self-discovery? Did you have mentors?
Yes, absolutely. So some of my mentors, when it comes to ochre pigment, were Helen Gallagher in the Oswego Indian Band, as well as my dad. They've taken me to ochre harvesting sites throughout my childhood and young adult life. And so they've taught me how to work with paint, grinding down the rocks into pigment, turning it into paint. But then from there, I went through combining that ochre pigment that I harvested and learned from them with other materials to create my own paint. And then at other times, I've had that paint color matched by stores, just because it is so precious when it's made that to use it in a large amount, I don't want to take too much, take more than I need. Mm-hmm.
How long does it take you to create the small ones?
For sure. Well, it depends where you want to start. Like for starters, it could be your time and gas money into getting to that place, your hours of hiking up to that place to gather it, carrying a bag of some heavy rocks back down, breaking those rocks apart into smaller pieces, grinding them down further, turning it into a finer powder. So I would estimate that even like a handful of ochre pigment could already be at about 40 hours of labor. And then if you decide to mix it with other materials to make it more liquid based and not just the powder, it takes a fair amount.
That's an amazing connection to the earth and just that connectedness. It's just
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really beautiful material to work with.
What does it mean to you to have kind of a youth from your community here to support you, and if you've got any words of wisdom for them?
Oh boy. You're gonna make me cry. It means everything. Like, when I was a kid, hold on a second. When I grew up, I didn't know anybody that was a career artist. We can't help that we live in this capitalist world where we have to pay our bills. I knew many people that, did their own artwork in the evenings and on weekends, but nobody that made that their career. And so the fact that I can do that now and do something I love, and to be able to show kids in my own community means everything to me. Yeah.
Just really want to thank you, Taylor, for your talk, and for the class who's here. It's so awesome in your community. And to really echo what you said about the critical importance of seeing Seal iconography, visual language here, and we're so excited to share it here, and there needs to be more. This campus needs more, cities need more. So with that excellent talk, I invite you to just enjoy the catering. We will have an opening and some other words to share at 5 o'clock. So please make your way to see the work, walk around or in the round.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you guys.
She's like,